Today we're going to be talking about the reasons why cells divide. Cells cannot grow indefinitely, and there are a couple of main reasons for that, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. As you all know, an organism is going to increase its number of cells as it grows, right? So, and we don't increase the size of our cells. We're going to increase the number of our cells as we grow as individuals. So whether it's a person or a tree or a killer whale or whatever it is. I wish as a biology teacher that our cells got bigger as we got older. I would love nothing more than to harvest a cell the size of a spare tire from a blue whale and bring it in and show my students. But that's simply not the case. A blue whale is bigger because it has more cells than a human does. And cells are really, really, really small. The average adult is made up of roughly 33 trillion cells, and they're all about the same size, microscopic. So in order to kind of look at this, we're going to kind of break down the two main reasons why cells divide. And really, both reasons, it kind of comes back to self-preservation, so preserving the cell itself. The first reason that cells divide is a problem that's called DNA overload. So again, I've mentioned this before, scientists not always the most creative bunch. DNA overload is implying that the DNA will actually become overloaded or overworked. When a cell is created through division, it has kind of an ideal size in mind. And so with that in mind, the DNA is set up to deal with a cell of a certain size. The DNA, we can't make any more DNA. Like, we could replicate our DNA, but it's still going to be the same DNA. Okay, we can't make more of it. We can't give it more instructions. We can just duplicate what we already have. So when DNA, those instructions are set. What I always tell my students is, I am, pretty well versed in managing classrooms and things of that nature. And in a classroom of, up to 30 students is usually pretty manageable. If I were suddenly put into a classroom and told to teach biology to 45 or 50 students, I would be overloaded. I would be overwhelmed. I wouldn't have enough materials. I wouldn't probably be able to keep them all in line. I wouldn't have enough seats in my room. So I would be overwhelmed, much like the DNA is in a cell, of when that cell becomes a very large cell. And so there's a nice even range that the DNA likes to stay in. It likes to keep that cell in. And so before the cell becomes too large, if the DNA even starts to get an inkling of being overloaded, the cell is going to take some pretty drastic measures. Because again, the DNA is only set up to regulate the cell of a certain size. Another analogy I would let you think about here is, imagine if you have a small town, and in that small town of, let's say, 500 people, they have a library. And that library provides books and information and everything that town needs. Well, if that town starts to grow and the library does not grow along with it, that library will quickly become inefficient in terms of supplying the information needed for that town. So if it's a town of 500 and the library does very well, and years go by and that town is now 5,000 people, that same little tiny library that they had probably isn't going to be sufficient to supply enough books and information to all those people. So that's another way to think of it. The second reason that cells don't grow indefinitely and that cells divide is to alleviate a problem dealing with how they exchange materials. And so we call this the exchange rate of materials. It's getting good materials into the cell and getting unwanted or unneeded materials out of the cell. So things like food and water and nutrients must come in, and all the waste products that are created during chemical reactions have to leave the cell. All of this transfer of all these materials takes place at the cell membrane. Okay? And so as a cell grows, the cell membrane also grows. Where the problem becomes is this is all dependent on something called the cell's surface area to volume ratio. Okay, so in a normal size cell, it's going to look something like this. We're going to say that this cell has a 6:1 surface area to volume ratio, and I'm going to explain what that means. So surface area, it refers to the cell membrane. It's the amount of space, the amount of workable space that the cell membrane has available for exchange. The volume is the area inside of the cell. Okay, that's the volume that it takes up. When our cell gets larger, okay, what happens is the volume of this cell increases much more rapidly than the surface area does. So we move from something like a 6:1 ratio to maybe a 3:1 ratio. That ratio decreases. And when that ratio decreases, what happens is we're producing so many waste products and we require so many nutrients and so much water, there's not enough space in the membrane of the cell to exchange it all. Okay, because the inside of this cell has increased so much more rapidly than this little membrane. And remember, that membrane is the only place where we can exchange materials. Okay, so one way to think of this is, we'll go back to our town analogy. If we have a small town, that same town of 500 inhabitants, and it has a main street, and it has maybe a couple of other thoroughfares, and that's all it needs, right? Well, if that town grows now to 5,000 inhabitants and they don't add any new roads, it's going to be very difficult to move from one end of town to another. If you have 5,000 people living in a town and the only way to go north and south is on Main Street because no other road exists, there's going to be a traffic jam that never ends. Okay, so when we're trying to exchange these materials, the cell is not going to be able to do it when we reach this increased size, because one of two things is either going to happen. The cell's going to die from a lack of nutrients, food, and water, or it's going to die because the inside of the cell becomes toxic because it couldn't get rid of the waste. Neither one of these things are going to happen, most likely. In a well-regulated cell, surface area to volume ratio, or that exchange rate of materials problem, and DNA overload can easily be avoided when a cell divides. When a cell undergoes cell division, it's going to divide itself into two identical daughter cells. Okay? So when it does that, each new cell gets its own set of DNA, which alleviates the problem of DNA overload, and each new cell is going to increase its surface area to volume ratio back to something that the cell can manage. So by dividing, a cell alleviates both of these problems. And I always tell my students that the cell's not going to wait until it experiences DNA overload and then say, uh-oh, we've got to divide. If a cell is experiencing DNA overload, it's too late, that cell is doomed. If a cell is experiencing a problem with the surface area to volume ratio, it's too late. That cell is doomed. So the cell has ways of knowing when it's becoming large, and before it becomes too large, when it reaches full size, that's when the signals are going to be sent that we need to replicate all of the DNA and prepare for cell division. Because with cell division, we can eliminate these two major problems that face cells.